This is Chapter 11 of Hattie Big Sky by Kirby Larson. April 5, 1918, 3 miles north and west of Vida, Montana. Dear Uncle Holt, how can I ever thank you? My monthly checks will grow like the wheat I hope to plant soon. Just think, Miss Simpson may read my first article to my old classmates. I'm sure she'll find a way to point out my dangling participles and awkward syntax. I am so pleased I don't even mind being a bad example. Carl shakes his head at me when I try to tell him about the scientific studies Mr. Campbell set forth in his soil culture manual. If I take Mr. Campbell's advice, I should order 7 bushels of seed, all told, for my 40 acres. Carl says I should order 20. That is a difference of 13 bushels. I would be floundering without Carl's guidance, but Mr. Campbell is a scientist. And with wheat seed going for $2.50 a bushel, his plan means nearly $33 more in Hattie's coffers. I would appreciate any advice you might have for me. There are big doings at the schoolhouse this weekend, a dance to raise money for the Liberty Bonds. This will be my first social outing aside from church. Yes, Aunt Ivy, I have been attending. Paralee is baking one of her cakes, but I thought it safer if I brought sandwiches. My bread is not nearly as heavy and dry as it was at first. Your niece, Hattie Inez Brooks. What do you think, Mr. Whiskers? I laid out my clothing choices on the table the night before the dance. The yellow gingham dress or the navy wool skirt and bodice? Mr. Whiskers sniffed at both outfits. He sneezed at the navy wool. My thoughts exactly. I picked up the dress. Time for a little color around here. It was foolishness, certainly, but I even took some care with that bird's nest on top of my head. First, I washed it and rinsed it with sugar water. Then I set it in rags all over my head. I left the rags in place till it was nearly time to go on Saturday. With some fussing and coaxing, my hair looked presentable. I held it back at each side with Mama's tortoise-shell combs. Mr. Whiskers meowed his approval. I'd finished making a stack of sandwiches when I heard Rooster Jim's team trot into the yard. I set the sandwiches on my least chipped enamelware plate, covered them with a clean towel, and grabbed my overcoat and shawl. You look awful nice, Hattie. Jim even clambered out of the wagon to help me up. You aren't so hard to look at yourself, I teased. Since becoming my chess partner, Rooster Jim had improved in the olfactory department, or maybe I was getting used to his smell. Hope you wore comfy shoes. Rooster Jim hopped back onto the seat and clucked to the horses. You're going to be dancing all night. I blushed, but managed to get the topic off me and on to news of the war. The Germans had launched new attacks in France between the Somme and Arve rivers, and were now claiming to have taken 90,000 prisoners. I couldn't help but think of Charlie. You ever figure out where your chum is? Jim asked. No. Once he wrote down the name of some town, but the censor cut it out. I sat quietly for a moment, thinking. I like to think they keep the airfields back of the worst of the fighting to keep the planes safe, I said. That's what you'd hope, said Jim. Hope and pray, I said, pushing away a sense of dread. Last week, we'd had our first local casualty, Mr. Kirkpatrick from Terrace. Though I hadn't known him, his death brought the war all that much closer to home. We were both quiet, Jim and I, the rest of the ride. Come on in, Leafy waved to us from the doorway. It's nice and warm in here. Soon we were inside, coats off, helping to set up tables of sandwiches, cake, beans, and cottage cheese. I helped make coffee. Paralee brought over a cake. "This smells like heaven," exclaimed Leafy. "How on earth did you bake a cake like this with all the shortages?" "I've been hankering sweet something awful. My gran used to whip up cakes out of nothing. I figured I could do the same." Paralee smiled shyly. "You cook up the raisins first. That's what makes it sweet and moist." Maddie came over and threw her arms around my legs. "We have kittens!" She let me go to smooth out what was left of Muley's hair. "We each get to name one, me and Chase and Muley." She leaned closer. Muley had a hard time choosing, so I helped her. Before I could ask about the kittens' names, Maddie was off, playing tag with a little girl I didn't know. It wasn't long before the room was filled. I waved at Grace Robbins, stepping inside with her husband, Wayne, and her 2 children. Her daughter, Olive, skipped over to Maddie and her other friend. The Schillinger brothers warmed up their violins as older children chased each other around the schoolroom. I saw Chase in the far corner, snugged behind a desk, reading. Folks were laughing and chattering. I didn't see Traft. "You think the Martins will come?" I asked Leafy. She made a face. "And miss the chance to make a show of buying Liberty bonds? Not likely." "It's for a good cause," I said. Leafy crooked an eyebrow at me. "Hattie, don't you know that man is trouble?" "Thought that was his horse," I said, trying to make light. "You," she laughed, then patted my hand. "I'll tell you what my mama told me. Handsome is as handsome does," I finished. "Your mama and my aunt." Speak of the devil. Leafy tilted her head toward the door. In walked Traft Martin with a handful of cowboys. A few men nodded at these late arrivals, but the music started up, turning the crowd's focus to the dance floor. "Don't them Schillingers play some toe tappers?" Leafy asked me with an elbow to my ribs. We watched others dance for a while, clapping and shouting and having a grand time. After a particularly lively two-step, I felt a pat on my shoulder. I turned and found myself facing Traft Martin. "Nice to see you again, Ms. Brooks," he said. His slicked-up hair smelled of Packer's scalp tone. It was the same stuff Charlie used to wear. He snitched it from his father. "Evening." I smoothed a stray lock of my sugar-stiffened hair. "Would you like to dance?" He held out his arm. I glanced over at Leafy. She frowned and turned away. "I'm not sure I've got the hang of it yet," I told him. Traft smiled. It was the same kind of smile he'd worn the day he helped me pick rocks. "And you won't, just standing there." Though I could feel Leafy's eyes boring a hole in my back, I took his arm and we moved toward the dance floor. The Schillingers launched into a lively tune. "Don't say I didn't warn you." I stepped into line with the other women. It wasn't so hard after all. Pa Schillinger hollered out the steps. "Ladies bow low and the gents bow under. Couples up tight and swing like thunder." His walrus mustache wiggled as he sang. "Leave that lady and home you go. Opposite the gent with the do-si-do. Jump right up and never come down. Now swing that calico round and round." The floor was so crowded, there wasn't room to make a mistake. If you did, you laughed, grabbed your partner, and picked it up again. The next dance was a waltz. "One more?" Traft asked. I nodded. He slipped his right hand around my waist and took my right hand in his left. When our hands connected, I swear to Christmas I felt a current of electricity jolt through me. Oh! I jerked my hand away. Is my hand too rough? He wiped it on his jeans. Or too sweaty? No. I couldn't in a million years tell him. My hands are still chapped from putting up fence. I hoped I told the white lie smoothly enough for him to believe it. I know how that is, he said. I'll be real careful. Then he took my hand again, as gently as if he was holding his own mother's very best china teacup. We twirled this way and that around the room. I'd never danced with anyone like this before. True, Charlie had danced with me at the 8th grade ball, but he was a worse dancer than me. We'd tromped all over each other's feet. Traft made me feel like a fairy tale princess, dancing in a gingerbread castle. Too soon, the song was over. Time for supper, Leafy called, banging on a pot. Traft thanked me, then stepped away, and I was caught up with the crowd of folks lined up for sandwiches. Grace slipped in line behind me. She poked me in the back. Hattie's got a beau, she teased. I could feel my cheeks were hot, and not because of the stuffy room. Oh, Lordy, Leafy threw her hands up. No such thing, I mumbled. Friends and neighbors, Pa Schillinger called out. Get you something to eat, and then let's talk about why we're gathered together tonight. Folks filled their plates and coffee cups. Mr. Sabot began his pitch to sell Liberty bonds. He wasn't as smooth as the 4-minute man I'd heard back home at the Excelsior Theater, but his heart was sure in it. Now, you all know my own sons are over there right now, he began. Mine too, don't you forget, called out a woman. Was that Mrs. Ervick? Mr. Sabot nodded. I've heard that there are more Montana boys fighting than from any other state in the Union. That brought a loud cheer from the crowd. Mr. Sabot waved his hands to get everyone's attention. No one can accuse this state of not supporting the war effort. Another cheer. There's one more way we can all help, and that's to buy Liberty bonds. Montana's quota of the third Liberty loan is $3 million. Someone let out a shrill whistle. Sounds impossible, I know, said Mr. Sabot, but it figures out to about $30 for every man, woman, and child in this great state. That's a small price for liberty. I know you'll all do what you can. I'll be in the back, so come on over and humble the Huns. Every dollar adds up to victory. You go buy those bonds, hollered Leafy, then get on over here and have some of this cake. Build up your strength for the next bit of dancing, added Pa Schillinger. I carried my limp and worn $5 bill to the back table. Mr. Sabot wrote my name down in his book. That's your down payment. 4 more payments of just $10 each, and you'll have yourself a bona fide United States Guaranteed Liberty Bond, he said. Next payment is October 21st. He handed me a pen. Sign here. I thought of Charlie as I wrote my signature. My little bit wasn't much, but if everybody all over the country helped a little bit, it would add up to something. Add up to victory, like Mr. Sabot said. I was so thankful for my newspaper money. I wouldn't have been able to buy even a penny's worth of war stamps otherwise, let alone a Liberty Bond. Here you go, Hattie. Mr. Sabot handed me a green button. Wear this to show your Uncle Sam's partner. As I pinned it on, someone stepped up behind me. Traft. Let me take a look at those names there, Sabot, he said. Mr. Sabot closed his receipt book. That is none of your business. Well, I see that different, Traft replied. He surveyed the room like he was surveying the range. As a member of the Dawson County Council of Defense, I'm sworn to identify slackers and encourage them to do their patriotic duty. His loud words stopped the children's game of tag. Paralee scurried across the room and grabbed Maddie. I couldn't see where Chase was. This county measured up in the first 2 Liberty loan drives, answered Mr. Sabot. No reason to doubt it won't happen again. Traft stared down the table at Carl. Seems like there's some that might like to see it not happen. I held my breath. Carl's loaf-sized hands curled into 2 rock-hard fists. No, I willed him with my eyes. I knew all too well how easy it was to feed a bully's fire. I learned that the hard way when I first moved in with Aunt Ivy. Franny Thompson had been wicked cruel about my being an orphan, and one day I couldn't let it go. If Charlie hadn't stepped in, we'd probably still have been at it, hammer and tongs today. Carl took a step toward Traft. That step was matched by one of Traft's own. Leafy broke the spell. Let's have some music, Pa. She slapped her hands together so loud it sounded like a gunshot. She crossed the room and held her hand out to Mr. Sabot. Lady's choice, Mr. Sabot, and I choose you. Pa grabbed his violin and began to play. But is everyone pulling their fair share? That's the question I'm asking. Traft's cowboys came to stand behind him, apparently oblivious to the music that signaled a lively dance called the racket. I caught a glisten of perspiration on Mr. Sabot's upper lip. Leafy wedged herself between Traft and the table. My own palms were slick and sticky. My feet stuck to the floor. I glanced over at Paralee, Maddie clutching at her skirt, and back at Carl, whose hands had pounded hundreds of staples in my fence. My fence, because he was my neighbor, my friend. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on my skirt, and stepped forward. Mr. Martin? I took a breath and started over. Mr. Martin? I reached out my hand. This is Lady's choice. Would you please dance with me? Traft Martin turned to me with a bemused expression. The look he gave me seemed to see right through me, right to my back collar button. A most gracious invitation, Miss Brooks. He took my hand and led me to the dance floor, where we joined the other whirling couples. I swung by Wayne and Grace Robbins, and Leafy with Mr. Sabot. Leafy wouldn't meet my eyes. Thank you for the dance, Hattie, Traft said as the music whirled to a stop. He walked me off the floor. Take my advice on something. What's that, Mr. Martin? I brushed my now sticky hair back off my face. He tipped his hat. Don't ever play poker. He nodded to his men, and they all left. Pa didn't miss a beat. He began picking out the next tune. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I walked across the room on rubbery legs and found Paralee. Go, swirl a time or two with Carl. I took Fern from her. It'll be good for you. He does love to dance, she said. Then go. I found a chair and settled in. Fern was a sweet, round-faced baby, content with even the most inexpert of baby handlers. And I certainly fell in that category. She likes to be held up so she can see. Maddie appeared at my side. Like this. She turned Fern around in my arms so that her back was against my chest and her face was toward the dance floor. I was amazed to discover what a great comfort it was to hold that warm baby body next to mine. She calmed nearly all my jangled nerves. Maddie leaned against my side. I couldn't help but smile. It was as if these two babies were propping me up. Muley made Mama cry. Maddie tugged at the bow in her dolly's hair. She did, I said. For heaven's sake. Maddie nodded sadly. Muley was singing me a song, one Carl's mama used to sing to him. A song made her cry? Little Fern had grabbed my pointer finger and was working on it with her new bottom tooth. I glanced across the room. Two couples stepped off the floor just as it was time for them to square up with Carl and Paralee. Fueled by Traft's fuss, no doubt. I sat forward, holding my breath. In an instant, Grace and Wayne Robbins stepped across the empty space and snatched Carl and Paralee up in a new square. God bless you, I murmured. But Chase said it was the fence falling down, Maddie continued. He said that's what made her cry. Fence? I turned to her. She nodded. Lots of it fell down, and there wasn't even a storm or stampede or anything. Maddie wiped Fern's baby drool off my hand with the corner of her dress. Then she turned her face up to me. Maddie, is Carl a hun? Hearing Maddie give voice to that word was worse than hearing the most vulgar profanity. I wrapped my free arm around her shoulders. Don't you pay any mind to such talk. Maddie fiddled with Muley's ragged dress. Carl's making a cradle for Muley. Mama thinks it's for the new baby, but Carl and me know it's really for Muley. She wiggled out from under my arm. Miss Leafy baked snickerdoodles. You want me to bring you one? A snickerdoodle sounds delicious. Fern leaned heavily against my arms. I gently eased her against my shoulder and patted her back. Soon she was sound asleep. I turned my face toward her downy head and breathed in the baby scent of her. Paralee and Carl spun by, he tall and solid, she round of belly and homely of face, and my heart filled up so full it threatened to spill out my eyes. I took stock of my feelings then and there. Traft might cause my innards to flip-flop, but that wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for something solid as 320 Montana acres, as solid as good folks like Carl and Paralee. At midnight, the sandwiches and coffee were passed around again, and folks danced some more. I danced several with Rooster Jim and Mr. Sabot, and even once with Chase. Last dance, called Pa Schillinger. He launched into Home Sweet Home Waltz. Paralee yawned as we finished washing up the coffee cups and sandwich plates. We set them out on the tables so the women could pick out the ones they'd brought. The sun was rising when we set off for home. Carl, Paralee, and I each carried a sleeping bundle of child and settled them in the Mueller's wagon. Night, hun, called Paralee. She leaned her head against Carl's shoulder and looked to be asleep before they were even out of the schoolyard. Rooster Jim and I rode along quietly as the night sky softened from navy blue to faded denim to pink. Sleep fast, Jim called as I slid down from the wagon bench in front of my cabin. I hope to. I covered a yawn. Violet will want milking in another hour or so. Thanks for the ride. I gave a tired wave as he and his team jingled off. I bumped open the front door with my right hip and swung the basket I was carrying through the door. Setting it down with a thump on the table, I yawned again. All that dancing had left my stomach hungry. I lifted the towel to grab one of the leftover sandwiches in the basket. My hands brushed against something. Muley! Maddie would fuss like 60 when she figured out Muley was missing. I took a bite of sandwich, then turned myself around. Who needed sleep anyway? Plug could get me over to Mueller's and back before milking time. I could catch a nap later. I regretted my generosity before I'd even gone 20 paces. There's nothing like a pre-dawn prairie to get the juices flowing. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Plug's hooves crunched against the stubby prairie grass, speckled with little cactus. Crunch, crunch, crunch. But what was that? No doubt some critter snacking on a late supper. My skin crawled, thinking of that hungry wolf from 2 months back. He'd have long ago digested Violet's tail and be looking for something more substantial, something a little over 5 feet tall and 130 pounds. I shivered, doubly glad to be up on Plug's back. Folks don't appreciate how open a prairie is, how there is absolutely no place to hide. Hey there, Plug. I kicked my heels into his sides to pick up the pace over the hardened sod. Lord knows how I could have thought that old horse would outrun anything, but there's not a lot of clear thinking when you're alone on the prairie at sunrise. If I hadn't given myself the willies over the prairie's nighttime noises, I might have noticed it sooner. At the bottom of the cut bank, about a mile long, I smelled it. Smoke. I urged Plug up the coulee. As we bumped over the top, the smell hit me hard, like a wildly thrown pitch. Smoke. And it was coming from the direction of Paraly's.